Do you really know what's going on in Sheikh Jarrah? So, Jerusalem was split into two. The east was for the Palestinians and the west was for the Israelis. Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood in the east side of Jerusalem. Then there's the Israeli settlers. Israel has a law that states that every Jew can return to Israel. They give them a passport and they give them a house. Whose houses do they give? The Palestinians' house. So these settlers come in, help the new Israelis steal Palestinians' homes. With the help of the Israeli police, did you know that these Israeli settlers are illegal internationally and the government backs them up? And if Palestinians try to defend themselves, the police just kicks them out, or they just end up homeless, nowhere to go. There is no happy land for these Palestinians who lose their homes. There are also 6 families in May that are going to be kicked using this law order, and even 7 in the month of August. That's without even counting the hundreds and hundreds of people who've lost their homes in Palestine. And it's not just that. Israeli settlers go in with weapons and try to kick out people out of their homes. Let's talk about the peaceful protests that are being done in Sheikh Jarrah. These protests are being done against the unjust occupation of Palestine, the racism, the ethnic cleansing being done, against stealing people's homes, and against the Israeli settlers. Now, these settlers have been throwing things at the protesters who have been fasting in Ramadan, praying together and feasting together. And the police throwing tear gas at the protesters. That's what you get for protecting your country. And we haven't even talked about the people who've been praying in Al-Aqsa Mosque and have been shot dead and attacked by the police. And they have been arresting people and kids. And yesterday, Israel bombed Gaza, where 20 people have died, including 9 children. As an Arab or as a person, as a human being, what can be done? You can raise awareness about what's happening in Palestine and how dramatic it is. Here's a video of a settler kicking Palestinians out of their homes.
Jacob, you know this is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me? I didn't do this. I didn't do this.
But
It's
you
easy to yell at me, but I didn't do this.
you are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
Well, Mohammed Al-Kurd joins me now from Sheikh Jarrah. Thank you very much for joining us. You grew up in the neighborhood. Your family home is slated for eviction. What is the scene right now?
Well, I thank you so much for having me. To start, it's not really an eviction. It's forced ethnic displacement, to be accurate, because an eviction implies legal authority. While the Israeli occupation has no legitimate jurisdiction over the eastern parts of occupied Jerusalem under international law, it also implies the presence of a landlord, and certainly these Israeli settlers have not built our homes. They're not our landlords. They don't own our land. And thirdly, eviction does not imply the hundreds and hundreds of heavily armed police and army and settlers colluding, blowing up your doors, throwing your children from your windows, and using brute force to throw you out in the street and assaulting and arrest you should you resist. It doesn't imply the grenades. It doesn't imply the rubber-coated bullets. It's not an eviction. According to the UN and countless politicians and human rights organizations, it could amount to war crimes. Actually, the situation is pretty tense, I can tell you, and we're very scared of losing our homes to Israeli settler organizations.
These settlers and courts would argue that their claims to the land predates you and your family. Have you been allowed to prove otherwise?
No. The Israeli occupation courts take their documents without verification, without authentication or challenge, whereas our documents will not be looked at. They will not be taken into consideration. Besides, just because something is technically legal does not mean it's ethical or moral or historically just or accurate or correct. We've seen many systems exploit the law and exploit the judiciary to uphold supremacist and racist lives.
You've written very powerfully about being 11 and remembering this incident that I spoke about these settlers coming to your home and taking half of it. How does it feel to have grown up with what you've called the anxiety of dispossession?
It feels familiar because this is what every Palestinian feels like under the crushing fangs of Israeli colonialism in Palestine. My grandmother was thrown out of her home in 1948 in Haifa, and she was thrown out again in 1967 and again in 2009 when Israeli settler organizations colluding with the Israeli state took over half of our home. And this is my second time being dispossessed from my family should they go ahead and do it to me. It's it's scary, but it also has a name. It's settler colonialism, and it's apartheid, and it's the fact that these settler organizations are working together with the state to exploit the law to dispossess Palestinians.
What would you like from the international community? There has been a response by many to the situation your family is in right now. What would you like to hear, especially from the new Biden administration?
Well, I think the myths of self-defense and both sides are growing more and more penetrable. People are being able to see through these myths and call an occupation for what it is and call an aggressor for what it is. And this is what we're going under, where we're facing in Sheikh Jarrah, in Jerusalem, in the Gaza Strip, in Lid, is colonial violence. And it's only allowed because both the state and the settlers know they have impunity. The settlers are emboldened by an apartheid state that allows them to open carry in Palestinian neighborhoods. And the state is emboldened by an international community that refuses to call it out for what it is, that allows it to intentionally target civilian neighborhoods in the Gaza Strip and massacre 24 Palestinians, including 9 children, without facing any consequences. I don't expect much of the Biden administration. Knowing that Ned Price refused to even condemn the killing of 9 Palestinian children tells me all I need to know. Obviously, I would like the international community to hold Israel accountable under international law, but I also hope free people of the world do their part to push their governments.
Do you support the protests, the violent protests that have erupted in solidarity with you and other families in your position right now?
Do you support the violent dispossession of me and my family?
I'm just asking if you support the protests that are taking place in support of your family.
I support popular protests taking place against ethnic cleansing, yes.
We're speaking of the principle of self-defense.
I'm asking if you think that the principle of self-defense applies to the retaliatory, the airstrikes that they're conducting in response.
Matt, this is a very fluid situation. I would hesitate to comment on operations beyond, the rocket fire that is clearly targeting innocent civilians in Israel. So I would hesitate to speak to specific operations that have just occurred. But the broader principle of self-defense is something we stand by on behalf of Israel and every other country.
Do you think that an Israeli military response to the rockets coming in, a military response to the rockets coming in, is covered by this broader rubric of self-defense, right?
Self-defense often does authorize the use of force.
What you said about the principle of self-defense, does that in any way apply to the Palestinians? Do they have a right to self-defense? Do Palestinians have a right to self-defense?
Broadly speaking, Saeed, we believe in the concept of self-defense. We believe it applies to any state. I don't think that I certainly wouldn't want my words to be construed as.
I understand. I want to ask you, I don't want to harp on this either, but the Israelis killed 13 people just now, including maybe 5 or 6 children. Do you condemn that? Do you condemn the killing of children?
Saeed,
I'm asking, do you condemn the killing of Palestinian children?
Obviously, and these reports are just emerging, and I understand, I was just speaking to the team, I understand we don't have independent confirmation of facts on the ground yet, so I'm very hesitant to get into reports that are just emerging. Obviously, the deaths of civilians, be they Israeli or Palestinians, are something we would take very seriously.
Your answer, you're going to know as soon as I read what your answer was, that there's a big problem with it. You said, well, not a problem, it just doesn't answer the question. We believe that it, meaning the right to self-defense, applies to any state. Well, you see the problem, right? Yes?
Do
you regard Palestine as a state?
I wasn't referring.
Do you think you don't in the context of the ICC and the UN? So are you saying that you do not? If it applies to any state, are you saying that Palestinians don't have a right to self-defense?
I was making a broader point, not attached to Israel or Palestinians in that case.
So they do have a right to self-defense.
Matt, I'm not in a position to debate the legalities from up here. Our message is one of de-escalation.